Hey everybody, this is Rydo and we're back to Dear Esther Landmark Edition. We ended a little early in the last episode, so we're not quite to the 4th chapter, but I bet we're very close to seeing the load screen. We are possibly also close to seeing some reveal or something different. We just passed a wall with a bunch of writing on it. It is somewhat ambitious, I would say, that you can actually swim in this game. There is definitely a version of this game where you could have drained out all the water in these sections and it would have just been 100% walking the whole time. It's even a little ambitious to be able to drown and fall off the edge of a cliff and die. But I really am damning this game with faint praise. I saw some reviews for this game when I first was launching it about how people were fairly disappointed in how unimpactful this was. This Acts 22:0. We're getting more Bible verses mentioned, or Bible quotes mentioned too. Which I doubt that the religious aspects are going to play that big of a role here. It definitely is just throwing spaghetti at the wall to have religious quotes thrown in on these writings, with also circuitry diagrams and chemical diagrams and brain, nerve, flower, botany pictures, whatever they are. I tried to walk on the edge there and I couldn't do it. Alright, so we do have the change now, and this is what I was expecting to see, although I wasn't expecting to be underwater at the time. As far as the car accident, which this may just be the final reveal, and we may be at the end of the game a little prematurely. So we know there was a car accident. We know that Esther died in the car accidents. We know that the husband, we're calling him the husband, we're not sure if they're really married, of Esther, was probably driving. We have Peter or Paul, or two characters named Peter or Paul who maybe don't play any role. We have Donnelly. We don't know what our main protagonist is. There is a speculation that Esther may have been pregnant. Looking here, we can see that there's another car involved, at least a little bit. Which, yeah, if the protagonist we're playing as literally is just a passerby who came upon the accident, even that can be hugely traumatic. Our protagonist says he's injured, says he's dying. Why he's on the island, I don't know. There's a lot of talk of Donnelly as a character, and we don't know how or why he's involved. Clearly, they don't want to depict the any bodies. Yeah, I thought we might spend more time there, but apparently not. That's just going to kick in the music. They don't want to depict any bodies, which probably means the original version of Dear Esther didn't want to depict any bodies. Here we can see this cave has a very eye-like shape to it, which, yeah, maybe this whole cave is just figuratively or literally the skull of a person, and we're gonna walk out this eyeball and see reality. That one design is kind of creative and artistic, but it doesn't really make up for the past hour and a half of gameplay that really isn't that artistic or creative. I half suspect that I would fall down a hole that I just wasn't looking for, and that there'd be a trick. So we get a chest, an achievement for finishing caves, and we load into another section now, and it's much darker. We don't have that flashlight now. We never really got any answer as far as who's lighting the candles, other than it just feels like the candles have been placed because the flashlight was broken. Torch, as he was calling it, because he's British. And we have a whole camp here, which, yeah, maybe this is where Donnelly's story is going to integrate in some way. It'd be kind of sad if we didn't make it all the way to the lighthouse we saw at the very beginning of the game, but the game has done a really poor job of pushing us towards the lighthouse, since we've spent a lot of time now in the caves not seeing the lighthouse as our goal. And again, we have a path branch here where you can go to the left or right, which the cave section gets rid of that.
Junction, headlights in your retinas. Donnelly drove a grey hatchback without a bottom. All the creatures of the tarmac rose to sing to him. All manner of symbols crudely scrawled across the cliff face of my unrest. My life reduced to an electrical diagram. All my gulls have taken flight. They will no longer roost on these outcrops. The lure of the moon over the Sanford Junction is too strong.
So it almost seems like there's all these concepts have been they're trying to integrate them. The car accident in Donnelly and the island and goals, which have been mentioned too. It almost feels like these branching paths are supposed to imply different. Remember, I can't jump here. Like, they're meant to imply different pathways towards a road, more than they're meant to trigger different lines of dialogue. Certainly, if the gimmick of the game was that you picked different paths to get different lines of dialogue, they didn't beat you over the head with that idea enough. That it should have been fairly obvious, and frankly there should have just been a tutorial option. Now the character we're talking about is clearly now familiar with electric diagrams, but they said the drunk driver was a shepherd. Now it's possible that a shepherd would be familiar with electric diagrams, but it's not simplistic, logical, or probable that would be the case. You can walk on some of these rocks, but you don't have a jump ability, so you thought that you could potentially just find a path to walk on the rocks is a little low. And I guess if you have a bridge section here. Interesting. I don't know if the game reset there or what. And see, there's your lighthouse, which just doesn't feel like there's a way you would have been drawn to look and see the lighthouse. Yeah. It almost feels like there should be an achievement around that. In a more ambitious game with more going on, you might have a lighthouse that you would look at, and then that would give you a compass or a radar or a point on a map to indicate where to go. But yeah, this game really didn't do any of that. It's not telling you to really seek out the lighthouse or seek out anything. It's just putting you on a path and expecting you to go on that path because there really isn't any other options. And yeah, if anything, I would say you might have an achievement for standing where lights are. It may not actually be a lighthouse. I feel like the first thing we saw in the first chapter was a lighthouse, but we may actually be looking at just a radio tower. Which might imply these circuitry and might lead to what would be a fairly ridiculous reveal that the character we're following is some kind of robot. I really just cannot care too much, though, about a narrative where he would be a robot, because that would just be silly. Generally, if this game is supposed to be around the mystery of what happened to Esther, it probably would be better if the main protagonist also was questioning what happened to Esther and searching his memories or trying to remember, had the old amnesia gimmick happening. You can see how much extra work it is to just take an alternate path a lot of times here. That's why it's always best, I guess, to go on the high roads in most games, because you can fall and jump down and maybe take a little bit of fall damage or no fall damage and still reach. So yeah, here's some more of that luminescent paint. But yeah, taking the high road almost certainly is the right move the first time playing. These paths barely branch off anyways. The music has stopped. It's just a lot of silence. Falling action, I suppose, is what they're trying to develop here. And then we just hear the soft gravelly sound as we stand on up. So here's actual photos, but
fire and soil, I chose fire. It seemed the more contemporary of the options, the more sanitary. I could not bear the thought of the reassembly of such a ruin. Stitching arm to shoulder and femur to hip, charting a line of thread like traffic stilled on a motorway, making it all acceptable for tearful aunts and traumatized uncles flown in specially for the occasion. Reduce to ash, mix with water, make a phosphorescent paint for these rocks and ceilings.
So I guess maybe you're the uncle. And here's pictures of the car crash, but even zooming in, you're going to have a real hard time looking at that. And I guess the idea is that this would have been soil and this would have been fire, just because there's slightly more fire and more lit up sections. Then this kind of looks like this is some kind of dry dock where you would bring in boats to park them, maybe work on them. Although, I could be totally wrong about what that's supposed to be. And yeah, it's really dumb to avoid this. So if you were going for a different story, I don't know how you actually would miss most of this. Let's see, we have a surgical spot here and the defibrillator, which definitely makes me wonder if you're not dying on the table and this is all just happening in your head, which would make a lot of sense. It would also explain like circuitry diagrams, or thinking you're seeing circuitry diagrams if a EKG type machine is hooked up to you, and the zigzag lines of your heartbeat on an EKG style monitor or heart monitor machine would look like a circuit diagram somewhat, not really. What's funny is as I walk forward, I'm noticing either texture pop in or reflection pop in happening a little bit there. And see, if you were just to have walked this path, there's really nothing here. This was boring. It's a funny thing, I would say. 3D platforming, movement technology overall has been worked on since pretty much day one of video games, and still we have a lot of games that don't move as nicely as I would like for the character to move. You'll have wonky floaty jumping physics in a lot of games, or you just in this case have no jumping and slow walking, which is quite an extreme. You'll have 3D platforming jumping that isn't quite exactly where you'd want it to be, and it's just difficult. You have games that sell themselves on being difficult. I can't even really tell just because of the contrast there what that is. I assume that's supposed to be a photograph of Esther. Now, a thought has just occurred to me, and perhaps I should have given this more of a thought originally. Maybe this is based on a true story, somebody actually mourning. There's a game called That Dragon Cancer that's around the idea of a true story of a kid with a baby with cancer. Although weirdly, that is a game that came out, got a lot of praise from same people who would have praised Dear Esther, and then years later the creator of the game said they didn't want streamers to play the game because that would be profiting off their child having cancer, when they made a game where they profited off telling the story of their child having cancer. So it seemed like it was very much a rules for thee and then rules for me situation being different. This definitely looks like this is supposed to be backwards, to the point where you're supposed to look in the reflection here to see it, but I don't know if there's actually a great angle you could have to make it reflect if it was supposed to do something. Yeah, and very much this feels like maybe this is a trick that in a game like The Witness there would be something revealed by seeing it in the reflection, but this game is just not programmed to have that kind of interaction. Yeah, I suppose if this was a real story, I mean, you can, as a human being, give some compassion to the person, is mourning it, although, arguably, as a critic, I guess I have to step away from being a human being a little bit and ignore that and just look at this as a form of entertainment or possibly education, and it's really doing a terrible job either way in those cases. And far too many movies these days claim to be based on a true story when they are based on the simplest or loosest of facts. Isn't that a random sound effect? The random sound effects are doing absolutely nothing for the game. It's just a gimmick. If this was based on a true story, I would mostly as a critic say don't base it on a true story. Take it and make it more fictional. There might be a white edge cliff on the side there to indicate, they said these white lines indicate that there's a sickness and that ships shouldn't come ashore for fear of spreading it.
There were chemical stains on the tarmac, the leak of air conditioning, brake fluid and petrol. He kept sniffing at his fingers as he sat by the roadside, waiting as if he couldn't quite understand or recognize their smell. He said he'd been traveling back from a sales conference in Exeter. He'd stopped for farewell drinks earlier, but had kept a careful eye on his intake. You could hear the sirens above the idling traffic.
Yep. Really, at this point, the only mystery left is who is who. Who has which name and who maybe is at fault in the accident, but probably doesn't ever get resolved, and that probably doesn't really matter. Like, we just want to know who is the protagonist, and there's a very good possibility that it will almost randomly choose which character I am. This is almost certainly going to be another case of me not being able to read it. Seems like it might be backwards. No, around him. Again, it feels like if this was the witness, your goal would be to find a high spot over there somewhere. I kind of feel like these candles are just indicators of an invisible wall, but they actually aren't. Heaven shone around him. Light from heaven shone around him. It's probably a Bible quote, I would assume. It's kind of a long journey still to get to that point, if we are going to get to that point. Although, who knows? Kind of seems like we might not make it to that point. It would make more sense.
From here, I can see my armada. I collected all the letters I'd ever meant to send to you, if I'd have ever made it to the mainland, but had instead collected at the bottom of my rucksack, and I spread them out along the lost beach. Then I took each and every one, and I folded them into boats. I folded you into the creases, and then, as the sun was setting, I set the fleet to sail. Shattered into 21 pieces, I consigned you to the Atlantic, and I sat here until I'd watched all of you sink.
So that probably means that there's 21 of these dialogue prompts, which probably means we missed some. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if this is kind of the end. Yeah. The end of the entire game, and it just kind of abruptly ends there. Yeah, as far as the random sound effects go, though, it would make a lot more sense if we'd already seen some of these boats. If the random sounds you were hearing were like car traffic noise sounds. Things that would imply you're thinking of or hearing the car traffic and you're still at the accident or on the road going to the hospital from the accident. We wouldn't have a flashlight here, so this is pretty much the only way you could be inside of a building is if it had candles. Here we can see birds, and the goals element still seems like maybe a bit of a red herring. On a sudden, a light from heaven shone around him, and he fell to the ground. Yep. Dead. Definitely sounds like a Bible quote. There was another game. I didn't particularly enjoy the experience. Just because I didn't particularly enjoy the story, called Oxenfree, and it has a sequel, Oxenfree 2, that I believe is either out now or about to be out in the next 6 months to a year. And in a lot of ways, Oxenfree has way more gameplay, way more of a mystery that it focuses you on and tells you you're supposed to be looking for the answer to that mystery. It's way less ambitious in the art style because it's doing its own hand-drawn animation in a 2D art style, but way more ambitious in the island design and the narrative by far. I would severely suggest playing Oxenfree before I would suggest playing Dear Esther, because you really don't even play Dear Esther, you just walk around. This is almost closer to some of the, I believe it was called Microsoft Encarta visual elements. I may be thinking of a different software from a long time ago, but there were these elements where you would walk around a museum
up the cliff path.
and just look around.
I swallowed another handful of painkillers, and now I feel almost lucid. The island around me has retreated to a hazed distance, whilst the moon appears to have descended into my palm to guide me. I can see a thick black line of infection reaching for my heart from the waistband of my trousers. Through the fugue, it's all the world like the path I have cut from the lowlands towards the aerial.
Yeah. So yeah, there were these old softwares where you would just walk around the museum and there would be paintings and things to see, and maybe it would trigger some dialogue, but that was it. It wasn't designed to be a game in any way. It wasn't designed to really be interactive. We even now see VR apps that try to represent a museum where you're just in virtual reality walking around a often asset flipped VR museum that's just a building with paintings and sculptures in it. At best, you get an example of those kinds of softwares, and the art is actual real art of note and pretty to look at. At worst, it's a bunch of random colors and shapes that have been made with probably no real artistic skill. And weirdly, a lot of those games are always being made for VR only, when you don't really need that. You can easily make a museum that just worked with the with a 2D screen. And before Unity's most recent troubles, it would have made a lot of sense to use Unity, and it still makes a lot of sense to make other engines like Unreal to make 3D representations of, this is probably the last stretch, of a museum. The isolationism and of the COVID pandemic makes it more valuable, and it's just more accessible in general to have a 3D representation of your museum. I'm surprised more of the bigger names like the major Louvre or like New York Metropolitan haven't tried to make their own versions of that, particularly since you could license it and sell it fairly high to schools and like sell it for $200-300 per computer to be shown to kids in schools all around the world.
I've begun my voyage in a paper boat without a bottom. I will fly to the moon in it. I've been folded along a crease in time, a weakness in the sheet of life. Now you've settled on the opposite side of the paper to me. I can see your traces in the ink that soaks through the fiber, the pulped vegetation. When we become waterlogged and the cage disintegrates, we will intermingle. When this paper aeroplane leaves the cliff edge and carves parallel vapor trails in the dark, we will come together.
It's funny, he's talking about both paper boats and paper airplanes. It's a little inconsistent there. Well, that feels like a place to jump. And as he was proceeding on his journey. I mean, it definitely feels like the game is just trying to get you to jump here. Alright, let's do it. Wow, look how badly programmed that was. They were just bouncing back on the wall. So the game didn't want you to jump. And certainly in real life, I wouldn't jump off a cliff with no protective gear or anything. But in a video game, yeah, it seems like that was exactly the move. And yet, it wasn't even programmed that way. Usually you have somebody screaming when they're falling off a cliff if they unintentionally meant to do it, or even if they intentionally meant to do it. Yeah. I suppose an interesting twist might be that Esther isn't dead, and that this is just happening in the mind of somebody who thought she was dead. That could be a little bit of a twist. But seemingly they didn't go with the idea or the trick that Esther might be the baby. They're not hinting at that at all. And has come near to Damascus. Again, we're getting that angelic singing sound. Honestly, this feels like this is more of a tale of somebody getting crazier and crazier. And that really takes a lot of really, really good writing, and video game writers are, let's face it, just not as good as the best authors out there. They're not as good as most good movie writers are. Anyways, inherently a movie writer only has to write so many pages to make a 2-hour movie, where a video game is going to be potentially up to 200 hours long, so there's a lot more writing you could write. Although in this case, this is almost a direct equivalent of a 2-hour game if you take your time to a 2-hour movie. And there would definitely be a lot more characterization and narration and themes and writing dialogue in a movie compared to this. So yeah, if it would be interesting if it turned out this person was just crazy and they got crazier and crazier, although in most cases in which that is the case in a game, you pretty much start to figure it out fairly early if you're guessing. I think Dead Space might be the best example of the
If only
secondary
Donnelly had
characters.
experienced this, he would have realized he was his own shoreline, as am I. Just as I am becoming this island, so he became his syphilis, retreating into the burning synapses, the stones, the infection.
So I guess we're going to end there with syphilis. That's how Donnelly died. I'm still not sure how Donnelly connects, though. And neither did he eat and drink. And he was there. And he was 3 days without what does that say? Sight? Yeah. Yeah, I feel like the secondary characters in Dead Space, a lot of them felt like they were going crazy, some of them were going crazy. And I felt like they were written fairly well. Although Dead Space 1 does have a nice trick there in that there's 3 or 4 secondary characters in Dead Space that are fighting against each other, thinking the other is crazy, so you don't really know who to believe if you're supposed to believe anybody. But that might be really the only good example that you have. You kind of have a twist, surprise, ending at the halfway point of Portal 1 that GLaDOS is crazy, but yeah, they what is it? Foreshadow. They throw some hints earlier on that is what you were supposed to figure out. And we've never really had a character that is just 100% a lunatic. Although, I don't know, maybe there's been a character in like Manhunt or Condemned Criminal Origin, some of the older games.
My stomach will weigh me down and ensure my descent is true and straight. I will break through the fog of these godforsaken pills and achieve clarity. All my functions are clogged, all my veins are choked. If my leg doesn't rot off before I reach the summit, it will be a miracle. There are 21 connections in the circuit diagram of the anti-lock brakes. There are 21 species of gull inhabiting these islands. It is 21 miles between the Sandford Junction and the turn-off for home. All these things cannot, will not be a coincidence.
So yeah, it definitely seems like the character we're playing as is crazy. And he's seeing coincidences as being connected with the number 21. But yeah, there's no logic in seeing patterns where there aren't patterns in most cases. There are a few instances where patterns do exist for the same reasons. The natural laws of physics, the natural effects of gravity and electronics, mathematics in general. Euler's number. Wow, I think I'm flying there. Feels like I was flying over the ground too high. I think might be an example of a number that in mathematics shows up quite a bit for no seemingly good reason, or gravity shows up being fairly consistent even in when it really shouldn't show up in mathematical equations. But it is just a human thing and an organic thing in general that our brains have evolved to look for patterns even when there aren't patterns there. It'd be funny if the flashlight started working right now and it just magically appeared. It would be funny if there was kind of crazier elements. You basically would have to be making a horror game though if your main protagonist was supposed to be crazy and you're going to go deeper in that direction, because that's the only way that really makes sense. Like Alice Madness Returns and American McGee's Alice, I guess, is a crazy character that's not really that horrific, and there's a lot of 3D platforming in those games. Or Silent Hill, for instance, those kinds of horror games where the characters are crazy. You can see how he's now trying to connect an electric symbol of a transformer, which I'm not sure how many transformers actually would even exist in a car. And then this symbol might be part of a diagram of an anti-lock braking system, and I couldn't even tell you what that's supposed to be. And then you see more chemical symbols, and then you see a circle, which, yeah, he's just trying to connect everything together, which at a certain level, who cares? It's not going to bring Esther back to life. There isn't any crazy deeper meaning to anyone's death usually. You potentially are lucky if there is a deeper meaning to your death. We have fences for the first time, which it feels like to me, of all the assets in this game, there could have been room for more fences. And certainly now that we see a gate that is open, that shows where a video game, this could have been much more of a video game by having the gate closed and you having to find the key. And even if you have to have loads because you just can't program the entire game to be one large area, which you should have been able to do that. I cannot really read any of this. Something to pass. Half of this dialogue is not readable by me, as I made my journey. It definitely feels like we're just going to get to this tower, and was something, I can't read any of this at all. It's almost like the game is inviting you to walk backwards to fall to your death. And it also implies that all the white lines we've been seeing before are not just people painting the walls or the cliffs of an island white as a marker, but are actually the painting of our main character, which it seems like he's probably made this whole journey multiple times. This is a kind of great example of programming in and asset flipping foliage and then just putting it on the wall and then having the wall and the foliage not really interact with each other. So it's very poorly clipping, whereas a small amount of testing would say, let's just not have the wind affect this foliage and make it more static, and only have this foliage over here that won't clip through a wall work, or just avoid that, or program it correctly and just have it so that the wall interacts with the foliage, and then the foliage only has a certain amount of distance it can move back and forth, and then you would script everything correctly. It might be something as easy as creating a keyframe to say the animation is that all the foliage will be right against the wall to start with, and then it will be far away from the wall, sprung back at the other extent, and it will loop back and forth as the wind blows. This is kind of an example of procedurally generated environmental elements not being fully thought out. And we're right at the end of the game, and that's pretty poor that that's what we're noticing. Something noon. We haven't seen a lot of stairs like this, and we could have reused that in the game more, and we could have seen more handrails. Could have seen a lot more up and down. I think that says something from heavens. You'd almost expect that we get to the end, light around. At the end of the game, you'd expect it to fly you up in the air and show you each bit of text. Although, what you could do here certainly is, as you zoom in on something, the main protagonist could read aloud what it says.
Blind with panic, deaf with the roar of the caged traffic, heart stopped on the road to Damascus, Paul sat at the roadside hunched up like a gull, like a bloody gull. As useless and as doomed as a syphilitic cartographer, a dying goat herd, an infected leg, a kidney stone, blocking the traffic bound for Sanford and Exeter. He was not drunk, Esther. He was not drunk at all. All his roads and his tunnels and his paths led inevitably to this moment of impact. This is not a recorded natural condition. He should not be sat there with his chemicals and his circuit diagrams. He should not be sat there at all.
So yeah, we're completely confirming now that the guy is crazy. The glory, what does that say? That lights. That light. See, even if we could read it, it's probably crazy, rambling being. Yeah, the worst case scenario here is you get to this point and you just get abducted by aliens or something as crazy or some unpredictable. Yeah, I don't know what we're really going to have here. It seems like we're going to get to the top here, and then we'll probably just have one last conversation, then the credits will happen. One ramble, one long narrative story. And it definitely feels like we're just going to be left to our own devices as far as how we feel the story resolves, or how we feel the story, what the story meant. And that's frankly basically just a cheap cop-out. Like, if a author doesn't have any meaning in its story and they're just leaving it open to the reader's interpretation, that author is being lazy, in my opinion. I want to be told a story, I don't want to interact with the story. If I want to interact with the story, then I'd write my own story, or I would collaborate with somebody writing a story. And even though video games are interactive, that doesn't really create an open invitation that the player should interact with the narrative in most cases. There are some exceptions, but there are some exceptions, like in Mass Effect and things like that, where you choose different decisions, or Skyrim, you make different dialogue choices and make different decisions that branch out the story a little bit. But overall, most games have a narrative written by the writers that doesn't change that much. And a game like this really needs to lean heavily in a strong, well-written narrative, because that's all it's really offering of its own creativity. Remember, all of the foliage we see here, all of the rocks here, are almost certainly made by somebody else that's getting very little credit, if any credit at all, via the Unity Asset Store. All the audio we're hearing, I assume the voice acting was written and performed by a voice actor, so that's something uniquely creative. It definitely would have made a lot of sense to jump around in different textures, since they have the textures of the fences and the buildings, and see more of those kinds of elements. Knock down fences here and there, or buildings and gates to block your path.
We will leave twin vapor trails in the air, white lines etched into these rocks.
So, the reason there's fences around these things is not just to protect the equipment. The equipment is also heavily dangerous. These kinds of towers aren't just cell phone towers. They often have lightning rods on them that could be charged or hit at any point. They often have amplified modulation, AM, or frequency modulation, FM transmitter towers on them. Also, a lot of these towers were for radio in the first place, and then had cell phone and maybe even some sonar or Doppler, in this case, elements added to it. And so the tower itself is dangerous to touch or be near, but they also tend to be surrounded by high-powered generators with a lot of electricity too.
Dear Esther, I have
taking
burnt my
control away
belongings,
from me.
my books, this death certificate. Mine will be written all across this island. Who was Jakobsen? Who remembers him? Donnelly has written of him, but who was Donnelly? Who remembers him? I have painted, carved, hewn, scored into this space all that I could draw from him. There will be another to these shores to remember me. I will rise from the ocean like an island without bottom, come together like a stone, become an aerial, a beacon, that they will not forget you. We've always been drawn here. One day the gulls will return and nest in our bones and our history. I will look to my left and see Esther Donnelly flying beside me. I will look to my right and see Paul Jakobsen flying beside me. They will leave white lines carved into the air to reach the mainland, where help will be sent.
So now we have the jump, although noticeably there, they really didn't even nicely animate you walking and climbing to the top there. And so the big twist, I guess, is Esther Donnelly. So we were, wow, and we saw a shadow there of a bird, so we've turned into a bird. So it is going to do the fly around. I guess the question here is, will the fly around let you actually see some of the text we missed? I hear, come back, Esther. And they're not subtitling that for people who are deaf. This wouldn't be very accessible for people who are deaf. It would work well enough. not that much that you could miss. You'd almost think that at some point the game would let me just fly around the entire island freely. And yeah, that could have been an interesting twist, as that you would just get a bird mode and at the end of the game and fly around. A lot of games would actually benefit with that kind of cheat where you could fly around. Really old games, some old games had that as a cheat, in the same way that a no clipping mode in Doom can be very helpful. I don't know if Jacobson was ever even mentioned until the very end here, but yeah, the whole story merges at the last second, in which you admit that you realize that Esther is Esther Donnelly, so every time she was talking about Donnelly, he was talking about Donnelly, he was talking about Esther, and then every time he was talking about Paul, I just got an achievement called Paul. He was talking about himself. None of it really resolves too much, though. There seemingly was no baby, so I had thought maybe that was the idea with the beeping sound. It's questionable whether Esther and Paul really were married or ever together, because everything is questionable because the unreliable narrator issue. You can see here we very quickly in the credits already got into special thanks, and we're getting credits from secondary development companies who work together to make this game, which this isn't really a game that needs multiple development companies to work on it. It's kind of crazy to make a landmark / remastered edition of a game and that was made by one person, and then have so many credits for so many other middle managers and upper managers. But yeah, as far as the story goes, Paul got drunk, killed Esther, then jumped and killed himself, or turned into a bird. He went crazy, and with his craziness, that's about it there. So it's based on a mod, and the Chinese Room is taking most of the credits from this. So if we hit resume here, what does that do? Seems to me like resume in this case is here. Okay, so that's not anything of real interest. So this will be the end of this episode, and then next episode I'm gonna try and just rush through the game very quickly with the developer's commentary. Honestly, I don't feel like there's a real branching path element here. I'm also going to make sure I know exactly what achievements, if any achievements are left, need to be unlocked. I wouldn't be surprised if I've already unlocked them all. But yeah, what I'm looking for in continuing to play this game, instead of just giving up on it and saying and agreeing with the other critics and saying it's just not a very impactful experience. It's really a game that did not deserve as much praise as it once got, and in modern 2023 standards, it's not a game anybody would give time to. You just need more writing, more variety in the locations, and probably you really need a gimmick of some sort. Even Gone Home is lacking an actual interactive gimmick, other than there's a bunch of 3D objects in Gone Home you can pick up and spin around, which is a pretty default thing built into Unreal and Unity anyways, is that as you're developing a 3D model, you have a 3D model viewer, so it's very easy to take that same 3D model viewer code and put it in the game and let the player view 3D models, spin the objects around, see if there's maybe a secret behind it. In fact, that gimmick has been overused quite a bit lately. But yeah, you definitely need more puzzles, or some kind of gatekeeping, some kind of reason to walk around. It doesn't need to be as crazy as The Witness, which is just all puzzles all the time, but to get to the tower at the end of the game, there needed to be a puzzle in the beacon chapter to get to that point. Something that would have made you potentially go back and walk around. It probably needed to be a circuitry puzzle. Since we see circuitry as a puzzle, it would have made a lot of sense for there to be a circuitry puzzle in one chapter, a chemical puzzle of some sort in another chapter, even a religious puzzle in the third chapter or fourth chapter. Since those are all three themes, there could also be a weight/goal puzzle that talked about birds or identified birds. Even one puzzle per chapter would have been rather appreciated if that was the one thing you needed to do. And yeah, I forget the name of it, but there was another game that also centered around a car crash, and you would walk around in a circle, and it was basically a walking simulator too. But in that case, there was a bit of a maze in the walking simulator in which the world looped around in a circle, and you needed to find an extra path, an extra exit for each section as part of the puzzle. I wish I could remember the name of that game. But yeah, the game I'm thinking of that I can't name is way more impactful as far as focusing around a car crash, which this one really doesn't have anything too much to do with a car crash. Anyways, yeah, very unimpactful, very minimal as an experience, something that feels very skippable. So what we want to see is if the Landmark Edition added a director's commentary, does that add any real value? Obviously, I'm assuming the audio and the video assets of this game are a little bit more polished, but they're not particularly diverse enough to be impressive or interesting in the first place. It's mostly just rocks and foliage and cave stuff. Very boring, not neutral elements. So yeah, I can't think that really is improving too much. So all of my hope, of which I actually have very little, is around the director's commentary. Anyways, that's going to be it for this recording. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and watch every second of my videos. If you want to support me further, there's a link down below in the description box. Thank you for watching. Have a good evening.